Do you have government permission to engage in your private sector job? Well, do you, comrade? I'm Scott Ott with Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, and this episode of Right Angle is brought to you by the members at BillWhittle.com. And gentlemen, Cuba is slowly reforming its economy because basically the old Soviet Union sugar daddy has been gone for years, and you just can't run a communist economy without some outside source of income. This story comes to us from CNN, believe it or not, and says that previously Cubans, and this is post-Soviet Cubans, Cubans were restricted to working in just 127 officially approved private sector jobs. These are things like barber, tire repairer, palm tree trimmer, or dandy. And a dandy in this lingo is Cubans who dressed up to pose for pictures with tourists. So basically you could get like a real Cuban guy picture. In any case, a recent reform effort driven by a guy who is technically their reform czar has now expanded to include some 2,000 job descriptions that it's okay for you to do on a private sort of capitalistic basis. And previously, like under the old Soviet Union, self-employment and capitalism were basically forgiven. There are now more than 600,000 Cubans who work in the private sector, although the number is probably far higher, Stephen Green, because of this lovely thing called the black market, which basically means the black market means that the default position for humanity is free markets. And only governments that acknowledge that and go along with that flow of human nature can possibly succeed. Steve, what do you think will happen to the Cuban political system now that thousands of jobs are now possible to do without being on the government payroll?
Wow, a lot to chew on here. The first thing I want to do is congratulate our Cuban friends, and I hope they enjoy this taste of freedom. I just hope it isn't too brief, which is what I'd like to get into. Number one, we thought in the 90s that economic liberalization and political liberalization would go hand in hand, maybe not as quickly as we'd like, but eventually. And that's why we integrated China into the world. I should say why we integrated communist China into the world economy in the late 1990s and early 2000s, thinking that this process would take place and weaken the CCP. Oops. Maybe the biggest strategic blunder in the second half of the 20th century. Just huge, awful mistake. We're going to be paying for this for, centuries. The second thing is I'm kind of reminded of a couple of things. One was Lenin's new economic policy. The first thing the communists did when they took over old Tsarist Russia was make a bad situation much, much worse. And, well, they're communists. It's what they do. And they had no money. They had no production. The economy basically completely fell apart. So Lenin introduced what he called his new economic policy, the NEP. And you had your NEP men and your NEPers and all this who suddenly allowed to go about their business and produce, did just that. And it restored the Soviet economy enough to get it back on a decent footing. I mean, they still had death camps and labor camps and all the rest, but to get it functioning enough that the communists could stay in power. And then, of course, the net men had all their stuff confiscated and more communism was imposed. The new economic policy was just a euphemism for capitalism because you can't run a country or an economy without it. The other took place a little later in the 1950s and was arguably even worse. Mao, the communist ruler of China, introduced his policy of letting 1,000 flowers bloom. And what this was relaxing the restrictions on freedom of speech and the arts and all the rest. And there was a blossoming of culture in China. But it was a trap. It was Mao's way of getting all the dissenters and the free thinkers to raise their heads high enough that he could chop them off. And this, I worry, is what's happening or what might happen in Cuba for one simple reason. They aren't saying you're free to go about your business. They're saying we're expanding the rules under which you can operate. The concept is still the same, that the central committee or some bureaucrat has the authority to determine whether or not your job your business, your pursuits are even legal. And as long as that is the way, it's the sort of Damocles hanging over everybody's head that takes advantage of this new freedom.
Now, Bill, Steve is right. In fact, the committee that drafted this measure that basically opens up some 2,000 jobs also explicitly stated 124 jobs that are still not permitted to be in the private sector. Now, CNN, being CNN, didn't go that deep and explain what those jobs were, but that is, Steve's right. The government is still in control of that. Raul Castro, who took over the dictatorship from his dead brother, is expected to step down at age 89 in April from his heading up the Communist Party in Cuba. And Senator Patrick Leahy of Vermont had an interesting quote in this story, and he said that the United States should affirm that our long-standing embargo was never intended and will not be used to penalize private enterprise in Cuba. That it's clearly our intent was to move the government, but not punish the people. Bill, do you see a possibility of a coming change in the relationship between the United States and Cuba? You, as a former Florida man, must have often marveled, how is it possible that Cuba is not a paradise and a gold mine sitting so close to the continental United States?
I moved to Miami in 1970, and I grew up around first-generation Cuban immigrants. And I knew a number of people who were either cardiac surgeons, brain surgeons, literally people like that, whose licenses did not transfer to the United States. And the next thing you know, they're sweeping floors in the Museum of Science. And what I discovered was that community was very, very tightly knit, and they would put their money together and they'd buy a tiny little store out on 8th Street, out on Calle Ocho, and they would save. Family would work 24 hours a day. They'd buy a second store, and within 10 years, they owned an entire chain, and they were doing great. They were extremely hardworking people. The Marialistas were basically purging the Cuban prisons. It was an entirely different group of folks. So I'm a little familiar with this, and I'm familiar with the bitterness and the anger that so many of those first-generation refugees feel and felt towards Fidel Castro. The thing that Fidel Castro, like Che Guevara and other murderers, is continually glamorized, but it is not a communist system. It's a kleptocracy. If you don't understand that, then you are really missing the point. He uses socialism and communism as the fig leaf to steal from the people. Fidel Castro, the man of the people who presumably lived in a fishing hut his entire life and only wore army fatigues, when he died, his bank account contained $850 million that was stolen from the Cuban people. $850 million in his personal bank account. How does he get that kind of money? Well, it's very simple. The numbers I'm going to quote are probably close. I don't saying the numbers are exactly right, but in round numbers, basically, if you had permission from the government to become a cab driver and work with foreign tourists, which would allow you to basically get hard currency, you could continue to have your cab driver's license for $300 a month, which meant that in order to pay for your license, you had to work the better part of, honestly, 20 hours a day for 28 days a month rather. You might see your family 2 or 3 days a month because you had to work that many hours in order to pay for the license. And if you paid for the license, you'd still do better than some poor schmo who's got a regular government job. And where did that $300 per month per cab driver go? Didn't go into infrastructure. It didn't go into buying his car. This is just a graft payment. It's a payment to the Castros for permission to work 20 hours a day. And when I say 20 hours a day, these cab drivers could not afford to lose a client. If they had Americans visiting or anybody visiting, they would be outside your hotel door morning, noon, and night, ready for you at any time, because that's how important the money was. And this is why people should be furious with this system. And just one quick note on the power of the black market. And how demeaning it is, and how absurd and childish it becomes, and the depths to which a communist system black market will drive you. I have been to Guantanamo Bay twice, voluntarily as it turns out, and I had a very, very interesting experience on the second trip. On the first trip into Guantanamo Bay, for those of you not familiar, down in the southeastern corner of the island of Cuba, it's a little bay called Guantanamo. The United States has had it as territory since the Spanish-American War. You cannot fly over Cuba. You have to fly around the island and come in from the bottom. First time I went to Guantanamo Bay, it's a short field, and we came in and made a normal straight-in landing, no different than flying into Burbank. The second time I came into Guantanamo, we came in directly from the ocean. We made a 90-degree right turn at an altitude that was so low that I was looking out the window and I was pretty sure they're going to put that wing in the ground. And rolled out of that turn and landed on the runway, came to a stop. So I said to the guys afterwards, I said, what happened this time compared to last time? He said, well, many times they'll let us do a straight-in approach to the airport, which means we overfly Cuban territory. But sometimes they don't give us permission to overfly Cuban territory, in which case we have to come in from the ocean, stay inside the border, turn at the last second, and land and hope we don't get killed. And I said, well, what determines whether or not you get permission? And he said, well, these flights come from, is it Mayport, I think, in Jacksonville? Jacksonville happens to have a Krispy Kreme donut factory. If we come down with 4 boxes of 4 dozen donuts from Krispy Kreme and hand them across the fence, they give us permission to do the straight-in landing. And if we don't have the donuts, then we don't. And when you realize that you're talking about human lives, really seriously now, that is a dangerous approach. And more than at least one airplane I know has actually gone into the ground on that, is determined by whether or not some guy on the other side of a fence is able to distribute 48 Krispy Kreme glazed donuts. Now, I'll be willing to admit that Krispy Kreme glazed donuts are extremely valuable currency, but nevertheless, that said, that's how absurd and ridiculous these systems become when you let them run. And it cannot end fast enough, not with a bang, but with a whimper. That's what's going to happen. It's just going to fall away like the snake on the skin of a dead snake.
Yeah. Hey, Bill, can I say just one thing very, very quickly? Sure. I will bet you that Fidel Castro had his army fatigues tailored in Savile Row.
I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah.
I love the Krispy Kreme diplomacy. And, that actually is a perfect picture. It's like no matter what you do to people, no matter how much you imprison them, enslave them, and try to make them, convince the world that they're part of some sort of revolution, they want the Krispy Kremes. And they not only want the Krispy Kremes, they want the opportunity to make the Krispy Kremes. They want the opportunity to open the door of a shop that makes those donuts with their own key. They want the opportunity to work their butts off for 18 to 20 hours a day and then clean up the place and lock the door with their own key and go home and sleep and wake up the next morning so that maybe their kid gets a chance to have a better life than they did. And that is an instinct that is deep in the soul of people all around the world. You cannot squelch it. You cannot crush it, and you cannot propagandize people out of it. No matter what they say in public and no matter how vociferously they cheer when the dear leader is waxing eloquent for 5 hours from the platform, you are ultimately going to find that America lies in the hearts of every person who has ever even heard that such a concept existed. These Cubans have a lot of relatives who are over here in the United States and who are pursuing that. And I'm sure not one of them has ever lamented when they hear that their relatives have to do what's Bill described, which is work so hard to, get one shop to open another shop and all the hardship they go through for that for 10 years, because it's a chance to have something that's mine and something that I can pour my own labors into, and a place where I can see the reward of my diligence, an opportunity for me to have the dignity of a man to stand on his own hind legs, to kiss the ring of no one, and to be able to march into the future with your children gazing up at you with respect. And that will continue, that force of history will continue to move forward. It'll be crushed from time to time by dictators with weapons and other ways of manipulating people, but ultimately it will out. And those people in the United States of America who look admiringly at the Cuban health system or the Cuban literacy track record need to fully examine the record and need to talk to a few people from Cuba to really understand what's going on there. I do think that there will come a time when we are, as a regular kind of thing, taking a vacation in Cuba. And when we get there, the Cuban people will be glad to see us, and they will be taking vacations in the United States of America, and there will be freedom after decades of darkness. For Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members at BillWhittle.com for making this possible.